King David writes in Psalm 139 that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, knit together in our mother's womb by God Himself. We are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. And how wonderful it is that cutting-edge biological science has affirmed our intricate and amazing design. Not only in our bodies, but throughout the entire spectrum of living organisms, incredibly complex schematics and designs have been revealed at the smallest level. Designs and unique structures that far and away surpass the most advanced circuitry and computer systems known to man, with specific functionality that require very precise and detailed information. Our special guest on part 2 of this combined episode of Apologetics Profile and Good Heavens is Dr. Stephen C. Meyer of Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. Dr. Meyer says not only is neo-Darwinian evolution bereft of any causal explanation as to how this information could have arisen naturally, but that this information is best explained by intelligent design. And that designer is the God of the Bible, the Lord Jesus Christ. Our adventure begins in the early 1950s at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University, where pioneering scientists have been making groundbreaking discoveries about the physical world since 1874.
The Cavendish Laboratory, an outpost, but in the heart of the university to which it belongs. Here, Rutherford first split the atom, but that was yesterday, and Cambridge is always busy with today's questions, using the victories of yesterday as a springboard. Cathode ray tubes within medieval walls, but there's no contradiction here. Today, just as when those walls were new, they contain some of the foremost minds of the age. The habit of a monk or the shirt sleeves of a scientist, down the centuries, they have followed the same star. They all wanted to know why.
Let's scoot along to 1953, and in researching for our talk, I discovered a lot of interesting things happened in 1953. Steve, you may or may not know, but Queen Elizabeth was crowned. Eisenhower was inaugurated. Fahrenheit 451 was published, and the first 200 copies were published with asbestos covers on them. How about that?
Interesting to know.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so Jonas Salk, here we are in the age of this vaccine, and Jonas Salk in 1953 administered the polio vaccine to himself and his family in 1953. And why am I talking about 1953? Well, another thing that happened, and this was fascinating too, all these things happened. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay were the first human beings to get to the top of Mount Everest. So this was all 1953, but of course there's something even.
This is a banner year. Yeah, because I know what you're leading up to.
Yeah,
right?
Pretty fantastic. You know where I'm going with 1953. So here we have, the famous Watson and Crick, who do who find the helix-like twisted ladder structure of DNA. And then you also have the Urey Miller experiment, where allegedly they created some sort of primordial molecular Frankenstein-like thing that allegedly we got all the right chemicals at least going in the right direction, and somehow we got some little biological thing going on there. So, but this happened in 1953. But before you started with that, I wanted to just point out too that the groundwork for both quantum mechanics and the Urey Miller, the DNA discovery was laid in the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. I mean, the foundational groundwork of all the legwork that had to be done. And over the door, this fascinated me. I learned this watching you talk to Eric Metaxas, that over the door at the Cavendish is Psalm 111:2, put there by none other than James Clerk Maxwell, who united electricity and magnetism. So there's a
great are
synopsis
the works of the Lord, sought out by all who take pleasure therein. And under that same door passed every day James Watson and Francis Crick, as they were unlocking the secret of genetic information. It's fascinating.
Right, it is fascinating. And so, Steve, I think you do a wonderful job elucidating this in your first two books of Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. that biology, and I know you attended the 2016 conference at the Royal Society, I understand, correct? Where they were trying to reimagine. We're basically out of explanatory gas, guys, and we need something. Help us to come up with some better explanations for what our science. The deeper we dig, the harder it is to cling to Uncle Charles's interpretation of nature. We need some interdisciplinary conversations going on as to how we might approach this. So I don't know. There wasn't much in the press about that conference and what came out of it that I read. But anyway, the current crises, I guess, for lack of a better word, in biology is this idea of explicit, direct information at the cellular level. That cannot be explained by materialistic, naturalistic causality. So let's begin with that.
In 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule. People had known a bit about DNA before. They were getting suspicious that it had something to do with the transmission of hereditary information, and the search was on. And it's I tell the story of the search and the competition between the research groups. It's really a fascinating tale in running up to the publication on April 25th, 1953, of a short 900-word essay in Nature. The greatest ideas can sometimes be expressed very succinctly, and this was one of those cases. Watson and Crick published their proposed structure for DNA. But I think an even more important development came 4 or 5 years later, when Francis Crick, working on his own, proposed what he called the sequence hypothesis, where he suggested that the chemical subunits of the DNA molecule running along the interior of the twisting helix. The twisting helix is made of sugars and phosphates, so that's the sugar phosphate backbone. But on the inside of the molecule are what are known as the bases. And the arrangement of those bases, he proposed, it provides information for building the protein machines, the proteins and protein machines that keep cells alive. So he essentially proposed that the bases are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or we would maybe say today, the digital zeros and ones in a section of software, which is to say it's not the physical or chemical properties of these chemical subunits that give DNA its function, but rather it's their arrangement in accord with an independent symbol convention, later discovered and now known as the genetic code, that allows the DNA to store and transmit information for directing the construction of the proteins. So we have something in the cell. This hypothesis was not the kind of thing that could be confirmed with a single experiment. It took 7 or 8 years as scientists working on both sides of the Atlantic were able to elucidate the larger, what's called gene expression system, or the system of protein synthesis. But in fact, what they discovered was that DNA it does contain information in a digital or alphabetic form, and that information is directing the construction of protein machinery. So that would be something like our contemporary CAD/CAM technology, where called computer-assisted design and engineering, where an engineer might sit at a console, write code. Code will go down a wire, be translated into a machine language that can be read at a manufacturing apparatus and then used to construct an airplane wing or a section of an automobile or a garage door or whatever it is. So information directing the construction of mechanical parts. That's what's going on inside the cell. It's a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system in even the simplest living cell. And that's what has to be explained if you want to explain the origin of life, because you can't get life going without that information, that digital code. And of course, in my book, Signature in the Cell, I unpack this as an argument for intelligent design along the following lines. I note that even Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that DNA contains machine code. Bill Gates says it's like the DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. We know from experience, our uniform and repeated experience, that it takes a programmer to build a program. Indeed, it takes a mind to generate information in any form that we find it, especially a digital alphabetic form, whether we're talking about hieroglyphic inscriptions or paragraphs in books, or the information that you and I are transmitting over a radio signal or some kind of signal going up off of a satellite or whatever. Information always issues from a mind, not an undirected process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life provides a powerful indicator of a designing intelligence acting in the origin and history of life. But for very, very powerful scientific reasons, I show that those strictly materialistic or naturalistic explanations fail to account for the origin of information.
Well, I know I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I did my master's thesis with Michael Ward. I don't know if you know Michael. He wrote Planet Narnia. He's a C.S. Lewis scholar, but he really turned me on to C.S. Lewis's imagination. Yeah, and one of the things that fascinated me in reading Lewis's science fiction trilogy, in Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis notes that there is this mythology that follows in the wake of science. And of course, Lewis's specialty was medieval literature and language. And I couldn't help but notice the similarities between what I learned from Lewis about medieval alchemy, if you will, using the sun, this quest for how to turn base metals into gold. And one of the ways in which the alchemists believed you did this was to sun your metals, to leave your metal out underneath the sun for just the right amount of time, and then maybe you'll get tin into some kind of a valuable metal or gold or something. But I noticed that it was I think it was in the Mystery of Life's Origin that was originally penned by that J.B.S. Haldane in 1928 proposes this idea of what we have come to more popularly understand as this biological soup idea. But Haldane believed that if there was ultraviolet light penetrating the Earth's primordial atmosphere and engendering certain chemical reactions with molecules and things, so here it is in the 20th century, we sound a lot like the Paracelsus and the medievals of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, where we're sunning our molecules.
You're right. It's the same fallacy that energy alone can configure matter in a way that will produce a propitious outcome. The shining sunlight onto lead is not going to rearrange the atoms to produce gold out of lead.
Right.
To do that, you need to rearrange things. And the rearranging matter or configuring matter in specific ways is another way of thinking about or talking about information. The technical term in origin of life research is the problem of configurational negative entropy. How do you rearrange things? How do you rearrange simple non-living chemicals so that they produce the complex information-rich biopolymers that are a necessary condition of producing life? And there are these models in origin of life studies called self-organizational models, where the idea is that either the bonding properties between the constituent parts of the, say, DNA will determine the arrangement of the individual constituent parts of the DNA, or that some sort of external source of information passing through a system will cause things to self-organize. But energy alone does not produce configurational negative entropy, or also known as functional information or specified complexity. That's to configure things properly in a specific way to achieve a particular outcome or function requires information. And again, information is the province of mind. Energy and information are not the same thing. Energy typically blowing through a system will be will cause a dissipation of information, will increase entropy and decrease information. There are systems where you can push energy through a system and create a kind of simple symmetric order. But symmetric order, like, you know, if you drain a bathtub, or if you have a vast wind blowing in off the Gulf of Mexico, a tornado might result. So you can produce simple order from energy, but not highly configured, specific forms of information. I used to illustrate this with my students. I'd have two Coke bottles fastened together with a plastic fastener, and I'd have blue dye and sparkles in the Coke bottles, and I'd shake them like this to create a vortex. So the energy going into the system would create nice symmetrical order, but the little sparkles never spelled Steve Meyer is your favorite professor or something. So energy can produce simple order, but it doesn't produce specified complexity or information. And so the idea of self-organizational models in the origin of life, I've always said, they do a good job of explaining what doesn't need to be explained. What needs to be explained in biology is not simple order, but rather complex, specified information. And it's you're right. I've never really thought about it. The fallacy is the same as the fallacy that drove alchemy, that energy alone could produce configurational negative entropy.
Right. And what's fascinating in the popular literature, of course, we talked about the popular literature of cosmology. The same holds for biology, maybe more so because this seems to be more in the forefront of people's minds, especially in the internet, with popular level atheism. And I'm sure you're familiar with Dawkins' quote that Darwin allowed me to be an intellectually satisfied atheist by giving him this vernacular to be able to describe things naturally apart from God. But in the language of the popular literature, and I think Carl Sagan certainly prolificated that. There's a wonderful clip, I think it's still on YouTube, I saw it a couple of years ago, where Carl's on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson was a big fan of Carl Sagan. And Sagan introduces this 90-second clip, or this 2-minute clip, I don't know how long, it's very short. But there was a series of pencil drawings that would it was an illustration, it was, these living organisms would morph, a fish would turn into something else, and the fish would turn into a whale, and the whale would turn into this, and the whale would turn into a crocodile, and the crocodile would crawl, and so, but there was this morphological thing, and that the audience is like, yay, that's great.
4 billion years compressed into 40 seconds.
Here we go.
These are molecules before the origin of the first cell.
Now they're dividing. Yeah.
The first communal organism composed of many cells. Here's our ancestor who was stuck on the ocean bottom, which then evolved gill slits, the ability to swim, something now recognizably a fish, an amphibian which colonized the land hundreds of millions of years ago. A branch led to the dinosaurs, but that's not our branch. Our branch is small, furry, scurrying creatures who took to the trees and then came down, invented language and technology, and became us.
We'll be right back.
But if you read The Language of Cosmos, or if you read Jerry Coignet or Stephen Jay Gould, what seems to be the case is, like, I picked out a paragraph in Carl Sagan's Cosmos a while back for a presentation, and I focused on the language that Sagan uses, and I matched it with some other popular level literature that I saw. And when they get down to the idea of where these body plans are coming from, where the trees or the flowers, or as you're saying, the specified complexity, that the kind of language that you drill down to in the popular level is something like, trees appeared, alligators evolved, birds evolved, bears emerged.
Yeah.
And there's this vague ambiguity when it comes, like a veil, Steve, where it's like, okay, here no farther, that we can't, the inquiry stops here, and we just sort of resort to vague terminology, and then we throw a ton of time onto it, and it becomes almost sacrosanct. And you can't question this. It's just the way it is. But it seems like, given your experience with natural selection and writing about this topic, do you see a similar hesitancy to go back a step further abductively and say this was all the product of a mind? Is there a similarity between the cosmology and the biology when it comes to this idea?
Oh, absolutely. But it's really interesting to drill down on the specificity of the mechanism. What kind of creative power does the mutation selection mechanism actually have? You're right. In both popular and technical literature, right, there's a kind of ambiguous use of language that I think is covering up a lot of ignorance about what's really going on, what really caused the origin of fundamentally new organisms to arise. Often you find if there's a major innovation in a morphological innovation, the evolutionary literature will say things like, it was selected for some given function, in the passive voice. Well, who's doing the selecting? Is nature selecting? If so, how? It was selected, or it evolved, these are words that are not really giving you any specificity about the causal processes at work. The claim is that random mutational changes that arise independently of the organism's survival needs, but will eventually hit upon some new variation that will confer a functional or survival advantage or reproductive advantage. Problem is that mutations in our experience, when we're dealing with, once we realize that DNA contained digital information, that in our experience of computer code, analogous systems, we know that changes in specifically arranged digital or alphabetic characters after very few changes, tends to degrade meaning and function. And it turns out that the experimental work that's been done on DNA has shown the same thing, that DNA can be, that sections of a gene can be altered by mutagenesis. And with up to a few handful of mutations, you can sometimes maintain function, you can tweak function, but when you get beyond a number of mutations, the resulting proteins lose thermodynamic stability. And there's a scientist in Israel named Daniel Tawfik, who, alas, has just passed away, and condolences to his family and colleagues, a wonderful scientist. But he's shown that typically between 3 and 15 mutations in a gene will produce a dramatic degradation in the structural stability of the resulting protein. So there's a limit to how much mutational change can be endured before there's too great a loss of information. If you ask a computer programmer, if you've got an existing section of computer code that codes for a program that you like, can you hope by randomly changing the zeros and ones to generate a new program or algorithm before you end up degrading the original beyond any function at all? And programmers know you can't do that. I mean, if you start randomly changes the zeros and ones, you're going to degrade the function of the original long before you stumble onto some new program or operating system or algorithm. And the same thing turns out to be true in the biological context. That's the point. So the point is, therefore, mutation and selection is not an adequate mechanism. It does not have the creative power to generate fundamentally new protein folds, let alone new organs or tissues or combinations of organs and tissues that we call body plans. So that's what the argument of part of the argument of my previous book, Darwin's Doubt, that the origin of new information, even in a biological context, even starting with a pre-existing organism, is a mystery from the standpoint of modern evolutionary theory. Mutation and selection lack the creative power to generate the information needed for morphological innovation, even at the level of novel protein folds. Mutation and selection can modify existing folds, but it does not generate completely novel folds. And protein folds are the fundamental unit of innovation in biology. If you can't build those, you can't get anywhere.
Yeah, it doesn't, and we've really made no progress since Darwin was musing about the lack of, I mean, it's a whole nother hour to talk about the Cambrian strata and the lack of precursors to all these body plans that are there in the strata. But it was a big problem for Darwin that really in 160, 70 years, we haven't really made any scientific progress on how to account for the phenotypes of all these wonderful critters that are in the strata of Cambrian.
Well, I'd say we made a lot of progress on getting a better understanding of the history of life. The fossil record is now, as it was in Darwin's day, profoundly discontinuous when we're talking about the origin of the higher taxonomic categories. Mutation and selection, again, do a nice job of modifying existing structures within very narrow limits. They can produce modifications, but not innovations. And what we see in the history of life is the abrupt appearance of major innovations that lie beyond the reach of the creative capacity of mutation and selection. And pose a great question too about where are all the missing intermediates that should be there on a Darwinian account of things. And that pattern has become more pronounced. That pattern of abrupt appearance and discontinuity has become more pronounced, not less, since Darwin's time. This was the subject of my previous book, Darwin's Doubt, the origin of animal life.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Your brand new book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. It reminded me that the whole idea of return reminded me of the biblical portrait of Israel coming out of Babylonian captivity and returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. And, it implies a loss of our understanding of God in creation, I think. And now, robustly, thanks to science, in some regard, the church is kind of waking up to this idea that God is absolutely, he hasn't gone anywhere. We're the ones that sort of went elsewhere and sort of left. We had a garage sale. We
in our thinking, we went elsewhere. No, this is the story of the book. The book weaves a case into a narrative, and there's a story here, and that is the rise of modern science in a decidedly religious Judeo-Christian context in Western Europe for specifically religious reasons. The early scientists wanted to study nature to reveal the glory of God. That perspective was lost in the late 19th century. We inherited a very materialistic conception of science into the 20th, but there have been three major discoveries that are bringing that back. The universe has a beginning, as best we can tell. The universe has been finely tuned from the beginning, and we've had these large infusions or bursts of new biological information since the beginning in our Earth's biosphere that have made new forms of life possible. I argue that when you add those three things up, or try to explain that ensemble of evidence that we have about biological and cosmological origins, the God hypothesis does and should indeed return.
It reminds me of the scripture in Colossians where it says that by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And I think that's a great way to wrap up. Steve, thank you so much for your valuable time. Blessings to you on your book and your public endeavors in reminding believers and non-believers alike that God is still on the throne and that he's the best explanation for why everything is the way it is. Final thoughts?
Yeah, the passage that Clerk Maxwell quotes on the Cavendish door, the door of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, great are the works of the Lord, sought out by all who take pleasure therein, goes on a couple of verses later to say, he, the Lord, has caused his wonders to be remembered. And I think we live in a very privileged time where science has discovered things that about events that took place a very long time ago, the origin of the universe, the origin of the Cambrian animals, the origin of life, the setting of the fine-tuning parameters. But all of these, I think, are provide evidence of the reality of a transcendent intelligence who is also active in the creation. And that intelligence has produced great wonders. They're all around us. We take them for granted. And I think science is causing us to remember those acts of design and indeed creation that make our world the wonderful place that it is.
Amen. Thank you, Steve. So just briefly, I'm going to leave all this information in the description notes, but what are some parting advice to Christians just getting their feet wet into this idea? I don't want to be overwhelmed with science, but what can I do to find out more about this? Well, I would recommend reading your book, of course, but the Discovery Institute has a wealth of resources that are available to people, correct?
I have a new website that goes with the book called Return of the God Hypothesis. And from there, you can navigate to the websites of previous books, to a YouTube channel where I've done debates and public lectures. On the website, there's a nice interview with Eric Metaxas about the book that we did in a public conference, and a long, an hour-long lecture that summarizes the thesis of the book. So there's some good entry-level stuff. I also have done a series with Coldwater Media called part of their True You series, a 10-part lecture series for high school and college students called Does God Exist?, which is summarizing the case in the book at a level that's very student friendly. That's on Amazon, I think. It's
Fantastic.
called Does God Exist with True You? So there's a lot of resources, and Discovery Institute has many great scientists and scholars. I'm just one of many here. So there's a lot. If you want to get an introduction to all this, climb on one of the websites and start to navigate from one to the other. And it's a fascinating topic. So we welcome people's interest.
The prophet Isaiah saw and heard the seraphim crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is filled with His glory." As Christians and stewards of creation, are we ready to give a defense of God's glory? Apologetics Profile podcasts can certainly help. Our conversational style interviews are designed to encourage and equip you to better understand the worldviews of other religions, cults, and ideas, enabling you to have more confidence in conversations with non-believers, planting seeds and pointing the way to the glory of God. For Apologetics Profile, I'm Dave Mitchell. Thanks for listening.